The smell of old leather and betrayal. That's what I remember most about the day I found out my son had forged my signature on a will that would steal $800,000 from his own sister. The ink wasn't even dry on the fake document when I walked into his study uninvited. He was at Walmart buying groceries, probably planning what he'd do with Sarah's inheritance money. I had come to borrow his stapler. Instead, I found a conspiracy that had been growing in my own house for months. The will was sitting right there on his mahogany desk, the one his father had built in 1967, next to a stack of practice sheets where he'd been perfecting my handwriting. Page after page of Margaret Dawson, written in his careful, deliberate script, each signature getting closer to mine, each one a small betrayal building toward something monstrous. My hands shook as I picked up the forged will. The paper felt heavier than it should have, weighted with lies and greed. According to this document, Sarah, my daughter who had visited me every Sunday for 23 years, who brought me groceries when my arthritis flared up, who held my hand through 3 surgeries, would get nothing. Not the family farm in Iowa where she'd learned to ride horses. Not the savings account I'd been building for her children's college fund. Nothing. Everything would go to David, my son who hadn't called me on my birthday in 5 years, who borrowed money and never paid it back, who looked at me like I was already dead every time he visited. The cruelest part wasn't the money, it was the date. The will was dated just 3 weeks ago, during what I thought was one of our good visits. He had come over with Chinese takeout from Golden Dragon, the place we used to go when he was little. He'd been so attentive that evening, asking about my medications, my doctor appointments, my daily routine. I thought he finally cared. Instead, he was gathering information, learning my habits, planning the perfect time to present this fake will to a lawyer and claim his elderly mother had simply forgotten telling him about the changes. But here's what David didn't know about his old mother. I keep everything, every receipt, every document, every piece of paper that matters gets filed away in my system. Harold used to joke that I could find a grocery list from 1987 if I needed to. So when I sat down at that desk and started going through David's drawers, I wasn't just looking for evidence of the forgery, I was looking for the whole truth. And I found it in the bottom drawer, tucked behind a maintenance manual for his Ford F-150, a folder marked Estate Planning in his neat handwriting. Inside that folder was a timeline that made my blood run cold. 3 months ago, Mom's getting forgetful, opportunity. 2 months ago, practice signature daily, study her handwriting from birthday cards. 6 weeks ago, contact lawyer about expedited will processing. Mom's health declining narrative. The health declining narrative. That phrase hit me like a slap. David had been telling people I was losing my mind, creating a story that would make the forged will seem reasonable. Poor old Margaret, getting confused about what she wanted. Good thing her devoted son was there to help manage her affairs. I don't know who needs to hear this, but if you're still here listening to this story, maybe you understand what I'm talking about. The shock of realizing someone you raised, someone you sacrificed for, someone you loved unconditionally, has been plotting against you with the cold calculation of a stranger. Subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. I've got more to tell, and it gets worse before it gets better. There were bank statements in that folder showing David had already been forging smaller checks from my account. $20 here, $50 there. Small amounts that wouldn't trigger alerts, but would get him comfortable with the mechanics of fraud. There were printed emails between him and a paralegal at Hammond and Associates discussing urgent will execution for elderly client with declining cognitive function. My declining cognitive function. I had been to my doctor just 2 weeks before this discovery. Dr. Peterson at the VA hospital had run every test imaginable after I complained about some minor memory issues. The results were clear. Normal cognitive function for my age. Sharp as a tack, he'd said. But David had been building a different narrative. There were notes in his handwriting documenting imaginary conversations where I supposedly expressed confusion about finances, forgot family members' names, or seemed disoriented about dates. Pure fiction, written in the careful hand of someone planning a crime. Each fake incident was dated and detailed, creating a medical history that didn't exist. The timeline showed he'd been planning this for almost a year. It started when his business began failing, some consulting firm that never seemed to actually consult anyone. The first entry was simple: need to liquidate assets. Mom's the only option. Not ask mom for help or discuss loan with family. Liquidate assets. Like I was already dead. Like my life savings and my property were just numbers on a balance sheet waiting to be harvested. But the most chilling discovery was a second will, one that wouldn't just cut out Sarah. This version, dated for 2 months in the future, left everything to David and included a clause about cognitive decline requiring immediate asset protection. He wasn't just planning to steal my inheritance. He was planning to have me declared incompetent and take control of my finances while I was still alive. The papers were already drawn up. Medical power of attorney, financial power of attorney, nursing home applications, all forged with my signature, all ready to be executed the moment I showed any real signs of aging or illness. He had researched facilities, not nice ones, the kind of places where families dump relatives they don't want to deal with anymore. Medicaid facilities where the staff is overworked and the rooms smell like disinfectant and despair. David had calculated exactly how much my care would cost and how much profit would be left over. I sat in that chair, his father's chair, reading through my son's plan to erase me from my own life, and something inside me turned to steel. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about dignity, about the right to exist without being seen as a burden or a bank account with legs. Someone once told me there are rules that change after 60. One of them says that sacrifice without boundaries isn't love, it's self-destruction. I wish I'd known that 30 years ago. If you want to know what those rules are, it's in the description. All those years of putting David first, paying for his college when money was tight, helping with his down payment when he bought his first house, watching his kids every summer while he and his wife took vacations I couldn't afford, co-signing loans when his credit was bad, always being there when he needed something, never asking for anything in return except respect and love. But respect and love can't be forced, and I had been trying to buy them for decades. I made copies of everything before David came home. The forged wills, the timeline, the fake medical notes, the bank statements. Everything went into a manila envelope that I addressed to Sarah and left with my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, with instructions to mail it if anything happened to me. Then I waited. David came home around 4:30, whistling some tune, carrying groceries from Walmart. He acted completely normal. Asked about my day, offered to help with dinner, even mentioned that he'd been thinking about having the family over for Thanksgiving, his treat this time. The performance was flawless. Caring son devoted to his aging mother. If I hadn't seen the evidence, I might have believed it myself. But I had seen it, and I knew exactly what kind of man was standing in my kitchen, unpacking groceries with hands that had practiced forging my signature hundreds of times. That night, I called Sarah, not to tell her everything, not yet, but to ask her to come over the next morning. I told her I wanted to discuss some financial planning, which was true, just not the kind David was expecting. Sarah arrived at 9 a.m. sharp, the way she always did. Punctual, prepared, with a legal pad and her reading glasses. She'd been a paralegal for 15 years before her kids were born, and she still approached important conversations with professional thoroughness. I spread David's documents across the dining room table, the same table where we'd eaten Sunday dinners, celebrated birthdays, played countless games of Scrabble. The same table where David had probably sat planning my destruction. Sarah's face went through several expressions as she read. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a cold anger that reminded me of her father. She didn't cry, she didn't shout. She just read every page carefully, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, like she was preparing for court, which, as it turned out, she was. The plan we developed was simple. We would let David proceed with his scheme up to a point, gathering evidence along the way. Sarah would discreetly consult with prosecutors about criminal charges, while I documented any further attempts at fraud or forgery. We would give David enough rope to hang himself legally, while protecting my assets and Sarah's inheritance. But we underestimated how far he was willing to go. 2 weeks later, David came to me with papers from Hammond and Associates, the same law firm mentioned in his secret correspondence. He told me that given my recent confusion and memory issues, it might be wise to update my will and establish some protection for my assets. The fake concern in his voice was perfect. Any outsider would have seen a loving son protecting his vulnerable mother. He even brought flowers, daisies from the county fair, and made my favorite coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, and he gently explained that he'd taken the liberty of having some documents prepared. Nothing major, just some updates to reflect my current situation. He used phrases like peace of mind and taking care of you, while sliding papers across the table that would have stripped away my independence and my daughter's future. I signed them, right there with my real signature, while he watched with satisfaction. What David didn't know was that Sarah had been recording everything from the next room with her phone. Every word of manipulation, every false claim about my mental state, every lie designed to pressure me into signing away my rights. We had him on tape committing elder abuse and fraud in real time. But the recording was just backup. The papers I signed weren't the ones he'd prepared. Sarah and I had worked with a real lawyer, not the one David was corresponding with, to create a legitimate will and power of attorney documents that protected my assets while giving David exactly what he deserved: nothing. After I signed the real documents, we switched them with David's forgeries before he could leave. He walked out of my house thinking he'd won, carrying papers that would expose his entire criminal conspiracy the moment he tried to file them. Everything I learned about trust, about family, about the difference between love and manipulation, it's all in something called the 60-year rule. 9 rules that reverse after 60. I wish someone had given me this 20 years ago. The link is right below this video. David presented the fake documents to Hammond and Associates 3 days later, confident that he'd successfully manipulated his elderly mother into signing over her life savings. The paralegal he'd been corresponding with wasn't expecting to see forged paperwork. She thought David was just an overeager son helping with legitimate estate planning. When she realized what he'd actually submitted, she called the police immediately. The DA's office was very interested in David's case. Elder fraud is a felony in our state, and David had created an extensive paper trail of premeditation. The forged signatures, the fake medical documentation, the timeline showing months of planning. It all painted a picture of someone who had systematically abused his position of trust to prey on a vulnerable family member. Except I wasn't vulnerable. I was angry, and I had been documenting everything. The trial lasted 6 days. David's lawyer tried to argue that this was all a misunderstanding, that David genuinely believed I was losing my cognitive abilities and was just trying to help. That argument fell apart when Sarah played the recording of David pressuring me to sign documents while lying about my mental state. It completely collapsed when Dr. Peterson testified about my cognitive test results and confirmed that I had never shown any signs of dementia or confusion during our appointments. The most damaging testimony came from Mrs. Henderson, my neighbor. She had watched David case my house for weeks, noting when I was home, when I was out, when Sarah visited. She'd seen him going through my mail when he thought no one was watching. She'd heard him on phone calls in my driveway, discussing timeline acceleration and asset liquidation. David wasn't just planning fraud. He was conducting surveillance on his own mother. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. Elder fraud, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes against a vulnerable adult. The judge sentenced him to 4 years in state prison and ordered full restitution, though there wasn't much to restore since the fraud was stopped before any money changed hands. During the sentencing hearing, the judge said something I'll never forget. "Mr. Dawson, you didn't just commit crimes against your mother's assets. You committed crimes against her dignity, her autonomy, and her right to age with respect in her own home." David never apologized. Not during the trial, not during sentencing, not in the letter he sent me from prison 6 months later, asking if I would put money in his commissary account. Even behind bars, he saw me as a source of funds rather than the woman who had raised him. That letter went straight into the trash, along with every other attempt he made to contact me. Sarah and I used David's betrayal as an opportunity to strengthen our family in ways I never expected. She moved back to Iowa with her kids, taking over management of the farm and helping me age in place with dignity instead of fear. The grandchildren who barely knew me before now stopped by after school, filling the house with noise and laughter that had been missing for years. We turned David's study into a library where the kids do homework, and Sarah works on her freelance legal consulting. The mahogany desk where I found the evidence of his betrayal is now covered with coloring books and math worksheets instead of forgery practice and fraud timelines. Sometimes I wonder if I could have saved David from himself by setting boundaries earlier, by refusing to enable his failures, by demanding the respect I should have gotten as his mother. But I've learned that you can't love someone into being a good person. You can only love yourself enough to recognize when someone is using that love to hurt you. The $80,000 I would have spent on David's defense if he'd asked for help legitimately went instead to Sarah's children's college funds. Real college funds, managed by professionals, protected by law, designed to give them opportunities instead of teaching them to see family members as sources of easy money. I keep the copies of David's fraud documents in the safety deposit box at First National Bank, not because I think he'll try again when he gets out of prison, but because I want to remember how close I came to losing everything to someone I trusted completely. Trust, I've learned, isn't something you give away freely after 60. It's something you offer carefully and revoke immediately when it's abused. 3 years have passed since the trial. David was released early for good behavior, though we haven't spoken. I hear things through mutual friends. He's living in some apartment complex outside Des Moines, working at a car dealership, still struggling with money. Part of me feels sorry for the man he could have been, but most of me feels grateful for the lesson he taught me about the difference between being loved and being useful. Sarah and I are closer now than we've ever been. We garden together, travel together, plan for the future together. She handles my finances not because I can't manage them myself, but because we trust each other completely, and transparency makes everything easier. The farm is thriving under her management, and the grandkids are learning the same values Harold and I tried to teach their parents: honesty, hard work, and respect for family. Some of those lessons took root. Others fell on ground that was already poisoned by greed and entitlement. But that's not my fault, and it's not my responsibility to fix. I'm 81 years old. I've earned the right to be surrounded by people who see me as more than a bank account with a pulse. I've earned the right to age with dignity, to make my own decisions, to trust carefully and love wisely. Most importantly, I've earned the right to tell my story without shame. David didn't destroy his plan because I found the evidence in his desk. He destroyed it because he forgot that the woman he was trying to manipulate had been fighting for respect and dignity long before he was born. I survived the Depression, 2 wars, raising children on a farm, burying my husband, and every other challenge life has thrown at me for 8 decades. Did he really think I'd go down without a fight over some forged paperwork? The real inheritance I'm leaving Sarah isn't money or property. It's the knowledge that she never has to accept being treated as less than she's worth by anyone, including family. That's a lesson you can't forge, steal, or manipulate away from someone. And it's worth more than $800,000 or any amount of money anyone could leave behind.